Welcome to Regulate Tech. This is our 33rd episode with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and...
with me, Richard Allan.
Great. So, Richard, we agreed that we would talk about what we loosely have labeled the institutional option this time around, which is when companies decide that they might want to cede power and influence to a third party or some kind of other body because they feel that that's the best way to make these decisions about that they're ceding to this third party. And there are tons of examples of this in the tech industry. One of the really early ones is an organization called the GNI. Tell us a little bit about them.
Yes, so this is the Global Network Initiative. And it was actually set up in 2008. And it followed on from a series effectively of scandals that took place in the mid-2000s where tech companies were starting to operate in more challenging countries like China. And issues were arising in the sense that, companies were either removing content that people felt should be protected speech, or indeed, in some cases, providing data to governments that then use that data to do bad things to the people who've been operating online. And so in the middle of that, you actually have a lot of interest from the US Congress. There's a lot of echoes of today, actually, that the US Congress was really interested in, what tech companies were doing in these more challenging markets, and really said, look, there were hearings and it was very embarrassing. Companies like Cisco and Microsoft and others and Yahoo at the time. So they were all sort of pulled in front of the US Congress and they were told to fix it. And the way that they decided to fix it, or part of the way they decided to fix it, was to create a new institution, the Global Network Initiative, that would be a partnership between companies and people from civil society, academics, other human rights experts, to draw up a set of operating principles that the members, the tech company members of this initiative, would then implement. And the GNI institution would have processes in place to audit those tech companies and make sure that they were sticking to the principles. So the principles were intended both to be preventive. If a tech company followed those, it hopefully would not go wrong in terms of freedom of expression and privacy in some of these more challenging companies, but also have a way of picking things up if they had gone wrong and holding the companies to account. Not legally, because this was a self-regulatory initiative, but certainly in terms of being able to go out in the public with a report saying, look, we found that the companies were doing this.
Yes, and since they also had academics on and NGOs on, etc., there were people who could expose an audit that fell short of the expectations of the organization as such. But let's get back to this decision to sort of cede power to a third party, because I was there at the time, you were there at the time, and I remember very clearly the debates and discussions that we had internally. And I thought it was really interesting because there is a pattern to these discussions that I think is recurring again and again and again. And the pattern, as I remember it, and it would be interesting to hear if you have similar recollections, was that, we do believe this is a problem. We don't think that there's a competitive advantage here. We can't say that we're doing human rights better than this other company. But are we really willing to cede the autonomy and independence that we have today to a third party? And that question, are we willing to bind ourselves here? Seems to be one that's recurring all the time. What advice did you give to folks internally when they asked you, why should we bind ourselves?
So interestingly, Facebook didn't join until 2013, and actually after sustaining quite a long period of pressure from members of the US Congress who had been champions of setting this thing up, they would sort of write almost on a weekly basis to Facebook going, why aren't you members yet? And Facebook held out. And, I was party to those conversations at the time, but it was, I think that the hesitancy was primarily about the unknown. We knew what we were doing when we were making decisions at the company. Introducing a third party, even an apparently sophisticated third party that was working with other companies, introducing any third party was seen as potentially risky. The risk being it would slow you down or get in the way or make you, be over bureaucratic. This whole idea of process and audits and things made people very, very nervous. And so they held off. And then eventually an agreement was reached where the Global Network Initiative allowed Facebook to join as an observer. And that was where I think essentially people like myself who wanted us to be part of this were able to negotiate something whereby Facebook could try being a member, test whether or not it was going to lead to the company, having to stop doing everything and start filling in forms. And after a period of time as an observer, people started to feel more comfortable. I think, frankly, as well, that the company started to realize that the risks were increasing as it moved into more markets where, there were going to be more human rights risks. And so at that point, then Facebook decided to join. So I was, squarely in a position between 2009 and 2013, essentially, where the Facebook sort of epitomized that hesitancy of a company that believes it controls its destiny entirely, sort of having or feeling that it needs to move to a position whereby it is now sharing decisions with a third party outside and is no longer entirely autonomous.
And there is something here that we should tease out in the name of honesty, and that I saw that several times, and I think it's an interesting phenomenon, and that is that there were people who were really interested in and super focused on the quality of the decision making, sort of, are we making the right decision here, who felt that they were in essence smarter than any other person could be outside because they had a bigger and deeper picture than people who were outside. So there's a little bit of a sort of, they can't know this as well as we can. And there's a touch of arrogance there for sure, but also a touch of sort of wanting to really make the best possible decision. Between arrogance and the good ambition to make good decisions, there is a hesitancy to bind yourself and see decision power outside of the company. Is this something that you think is particular for tech companies because they have a sort of a culture of hiring super smart people to solve really hard problems, and sometimes this spills over into those smart people thinking they can solve other problems better than everyone else?
Yeah, I mean it's a really important observation because I think it's partly because tech companies are built on this notion of innovation. So by definition, you believe you're doing something that nobody was able to do previously. You're the first to build this amazingly successful thing, and everyone else was, there may have been others who tried it and failed, but you're the guys who've succeeded. Like that's how you feel, and you feel like, you are the smartest people in the room, and that's a real risk. And it does mean, actually, as we talk about this whole debate about decision making, essentially the people who can make decisions about the content, for example, that's allowed to be circulated online are the people in the tech companies, governments, or civil society organizations like the Global Network Initiative and others. And I think you're absolutely right that the people in the tech companies often feel that they are better than those other two options and that they're going to make better decisions, and having to explain themselves to, let's use the language like dumb governments or ill-informed civil society organizations who don't really know what's happening on the platforms. That is, we have to be candid, a kind of common feeling. Over time, I think that changes. Sometimes it changes because the people in government and the people in civil society gain more respect from the tech companies because actually they are very good, a lot of them, and they get familiar with them. They can reevaluate their view of people outside and realize they're not so, there's not such a huge difference. Sometimes it's frankly because those people come into the companies. So the companies hire people from government and civil society, and now the person inside the company is a peer of the people outside the company in the government and civil society worlds, and that changes the dynamic quite a lot. And then sometimes, again, quite frankly, it's because you're just in such a pickle that you can't hold the line, even though you still believe you're the best people to make these decisions. Nobody else in the world believes that, and you're being criticized on a daily basis. And so the only way, that you can get out of this is to start sharing that decision making with people outside.
I think that there's something fundamental in your focus on decision making that's really helpful when you want to untangle this debate. Because one of the other things that I think sets a tech company up for misevaluating the institutional option is that a lot of the tech companies are driven from a deeply ingrained engineering culture where the nature of the question is this true or false? And true or false is sort of if you ask a question about something, you want to know if it's true or false. The political communities that we're all a part of and companies as well, they don't care so much about true or false as, is this the right person making the decisions? How do we live together? The political question is not, is it true or false? It's not even, is it legal or illegal? The political question is, how do we live together? And living together means that we want to make sure that there is a distribution of decision making, to your point, that is that provides transparency, that also, I think, distributes power, that, might slow things down, because sometimes that might be a purpose in distributing decision making. And so let's talk about this. You said that there were three parties that could make decisions. There was the company, there's government, and then there's essentially the third party or institution. How should we think about this in general terms? Who gets to make the decision?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to recognize the biases that each party has. It's really important. And again, over the last couple of weeks, people have been talking a lot about Facebook on the back of some documents that were put in the public domain. And the starting assumption is, look, Facebook only cares about profits. Tech companies only interested in making money. I do think it's a bit more nuanced. They're primarily interested in growth and engagement, which will tend to lead to money. But really, their sort of DNA is all about maximizing the use of the products they've built. They think their products are brilliant and they really want people to be using those products. And of course, if people use the products, they'll make money. But I think they're more focused, to say, on the growth and engagement than necessarily like going straight to the kind of money piece of it. But anyway, every time a tech company makes a decision, it is going to be biased because of their business interest, because they're trying to grow their business, they're trying to get more engagement. Like, that's a built-in bias. They can try and fight it, but it's there. When we look at politicians, again, they have their own biases. Their biases in favor of getting re-elected. And I've been there, and there's a logic. And the logic is, look, you can't do good for the world unless you've been re-elected. And so you kind of feel you're justified in doing things, to go after votes. And I like to think that most of the decisions I made then would have been in the public interest. But I'd be lying if I said I never thought, which of these options is going to be more popular with my electorate? So in a similar way to the companies going after growth and engagement, politicians have their own version of that. And I say in both cases, they're holding both of these things to be true. And then civil society tends to feel the purist. I mean, most people will say, look, companies are only after money, politicians are only after votes, which I say, I don't think either of those is true, but I think there's an element of truth in it. Civil society feels purer. But again, when we look at it, there's all sorts of interests. If you're a not-for-profit, you may well be looking for funding. And so the campaigns you run and the actions you do may be influenced by the fact that some campaigns are more likely to attract money for your organization. And again, your justification is, look, I'm still in the job and I have to be in my job and get the funding in order to do good for the world. So you've got an internal justification for that. So I think,
and to your point, I think one thing that's important in that and important to pick up on is this notion that you think that you know what's good for the world. The ideological motivation should not be underplayed when it comes to civil society, which means that they have a view of whether or not corporations are good, whether or not certain kinds of behaviors are good. So there's an ideological component to that is rarely discussed, because this notion of neutral decision making is largely fictional. There's no such thing, right? So and I think that's interesting, and not because it's wrong, but because it's not always the case, to your point. But I think because when we think about third parties, we shouldn't think that the third party implies neutrality. Third party implies another ideological perspective.
That's right. Yes, yeah, I think that's correct. And in the tech space, I think we're probably both had experience. There is a kind of mixture, I find, typically of quite a bit of libertarian thinking. That's sort of still there in the tech space, particularly in the US, mixed with, I actually find quite a strong element of people who come from a left perspective in civil society. And so, again, we've lived it over the last few years that the criticisms are, why don't you shut down these nasty populist right-wing politicians? That's what you'll get. And so people who are coming at it from that approach and saying, we don't like your decision-making, a lot of the time they're asking you to make decisions that are more aligned with their political perspective, which tends to say to be some way it's an interesting mix of kind of libertarian and left at the same time quite often. And so there we go. When we've got a decision, and we can get and talk about some concrete decisions. The question then is, which of these many actors with their own biases do you want to make that decision? And once we've surfaced them, how do we almost sort of cancel them out? I mean, we'll head in that direction. But I think for me, to get a really good decision, all of these parties have a role to play, all of them with their, I think sort of very clear view that they're acting in the public interest, but also being very aware that they all have other interests at heart as well. And if we can bring them all together, I think we'll get somewhere to making good decisions, which again is sort of in the structure actually of the Global Network Initiative, although in that case, it's industry and civil society and doesn't have the government element, but government was very strongly pressurizing industry and civil society to be part of it. And again, I think in that case, in particular, it reflects the US view of the world where government tends not to jump into these decision-making processes quite as much because there's a very, very strong tradition, as expressed in the First Amendment, of government staying out of decisions, particularly around speech and content on platforms.
But that's interesting, and it's worth also unpicking because you referenced the First Amendment, and there is of course a fourth option that you can go for, and that's legislation and courts. So that's courts are also a decision-making mechanism. So if you look at this and we start to unpick the criteria for where the decision should be made, one of the first criteria, one of the most basic criteria, actually seems to be efficiency, because a lot of actors, both in government companies and civil society, resist the notion that it should only be courts that decide, for example, what's left up or what's taken down. So if let's take a concrete decision whether or not we should allow climate change denial online. One answer to that question would be make it illegal. Then if somebody does, post something that is climate change denial, take it to court. The court looks at it. If they say it's illegal, post a court order. The court order goes to the company takes it down. Now, that option, the legal option, is sort of one of the primary options, but enormously rarely used. And the key, as far as I can see, the key reason for that is that we actually prize with a premium on efficiency in this process. So efficiency has to be one of our criteria as we decide where a decision should be made. Is that right?
That is exactly right. So I mean, the court option, I think, tends to be popular in countries where the legal code is sort of broadly aligned with where people are culturally. And isn't this a big gap? So the prime example, I think, would be Germany, where there's actually quite a restrictive speech code. There's quite a lot of German laws that sort of would restrict particular kinds of speech, not just hate speech, but other forms of kind of threatening and harassing behavior that in other countries might, not reach the threshold for illegality, but in Germany they will do. And things like criminal defamation, being sort of too rude about somebody, can get you into all kinds of trouble. So you'll find it there. Then there are a set of countries where the law just holds off in this space. And so if you say we're going to follow court decisions, it means nothing comes down. And the US would be an example where actually very little child abuse imagery and not much more than that. And then there are countries where they have very well developed legal systems, but people in other countries think that those legal systems go way too far, or that the judges are way too biased. And in fact, Global Network Initiative, part of the sort of rationale for it was to try and encourage companies to hold back in those countries. And again, an example, not surprising, one would be somewhere like Russia, where if you work in a tech company, you'll get frequent letters from the prosecutor's office telling you that opposition politician speech is illegal and must come down. So this sort of court option is theoretically great if you're a human rights supporter. It's kind of the notion that the decisions are being made by an accountable body, a government, and if the people don't like those decisions, they can lobby their government to change the law, and that the system will work. It works really well in that kind of theoretical model. In practice, it's very sort of variable as to whether or not it's going to meet public expectations. And then even then, as you say, that the volume issue becomes a question. And actually, those countries where they perhaps have the fewest human rights protections in place are the ones that can manage the volume. So the Turkish government, for example, I remember had no trouble firing off hundreds of requests from the regulator going, take this down, take that down. They had no trouble at all. You didn't get the same thing, actually, even in Germany, where a lot of the speech is illegal and the politicians were very upset with the companies. Even there, you weren't getting masses and masses of court orders on speech, and partly because they have got a strong set of constitutional protections and a human rights framework, and would worry that people would contest every single one of those orders and it would get bogged down and be there forever. So you've got, again, this sort of interesting trade-off where the countries that, as I say, perhaps have the fewest protections in place are the ones who are best equipped to issue takedown orders at scale and at volume. But they're the ones that, from a human rights perspective, you might be most nervous about. And in many other countries, a lot of noise, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, but their own legal protections mean essentially they have to defer to the companies to do this at scale, because their court systems are just not going to be able to handle it with all of the different routes of appeal and challenges and the sort of heavy judicial processes that should be in place actually for, speech restricting cases.
I think this is interesting because it goes to the question of who should make the decision in the beginning, because one part of who should make the decision is the legitimacy of the decision on who makes the decision, right? And so if you go for court, there's pretty robust legitimacy there, right? You have democracy, you have democratically, if you go to a democracy at least, democratically elected parliamentarians who can debate whether or not something should be illegal online, and they can then make the decision to make it illegal. And if you get a court order, even in less democratic countries, most companies say that the court order is sort of a line that they feel that they have to follow. And I think that's, to me at least, it seems that there's a reticence to use that option. Suggests that the efficiency thing is one thing, but the other thing is that there's like a belief that the court system couldn't handle the volume, which seems to be another sort of issue. How many of these complaints will there be?
Yeah, so it's the volume and then the way that courts and companies work. So one of the other things you then get, and we keep coming back to our friend, the German Network Enforcement Act. I mean, that's the most explicit attempt to say to companies, essentially, I think a little buzzing there from a mobile phone, I think.
Yeah, I'll put that away. Sorry about that.
No problem. So with the Network Enforcement Act, the German politicians were saying very explicitly to the companies, we want you to enforce a German law, German speech standards, kind of as though you were a German court. Now, in theory, that sounds attractive. We just tell the companies to enforce our law, but in practice, that's extremely challenging, because what court cases will do often is, someone will say, I don't like this content, it should be taken down, and they'll invite somebody to come and defend it. And there's a whole backwards and forwards. And I've seen over, single, almost use the word trivial kind of piece of content, but where somebody's got upset about it, court judgments will run to 12 or 20 pages where they've argued backwards and forwards. And again, that is the legal standard. The legal standard says you've got a right to defend it, a right to attack it. You've got to go through all these different arguments and precedents. And that, again, is not going to happen at scale inside the companies. So even where a company says we are applying the legal standard, what does that mean? It means we're sort of looking at an approximation of what we understand to be the legal standard. We've asked our outside counsel to give us some guidance on what looks illegal and what looks legal, and we're trying to apply that. But we're not, for each piece of content that we're deciding about, having arguments for and against in a courtroom type environment and writing a 20-page judgment. The people who do that, though, are we'll come on the External Oversight Board, actually the Facebook one. That is actually the closest that you get if you want to see what that process looks like. The External Oversight Board, I think, gives you a good sense of what it would look like if a company were doing it. And clearly they're not able to do it. Facebook's not able to do it for every decision they make every day.
And I think there's another interesting example that builds on exactly this, that there was a court case in which the court said the first instance for trying these requests has to be the company. Yeah. And that court case was the right to be forgotten case. In the right to be forgotten case, the court explicitly says that you can't just send all of these to the DPAs. assuming that they would be inundated with requests, etc. But you have to make a first assessment yourselves, and that actually led Google to, at the time, to take the institutional option to build an observatory that traveled around to listen in on what should the principles be for removing something under this right to be forgotten. And so it's interesting when one way to address it that I thought was quite innovative at the time, at least, and it met a lot of criticism, but I thought was interesting was to say, look, there is a request here from the court that we act as a first instance with delegated power. Let's go figure out what that is. And so you build up an observatory with a lot of independent third parties that then held hearings around Europe to see what can we distill, what can we crystallize from this in terms of principles that will allow us to do this first test, sort of be this first instance that the court wants us to be. And I think it's sort of a nascent version of the Oversight Board, trying to figure out what are the processes that we should adopt and what are the principles that we should be guided by. But that was an example also, I think, of the institutional option.
Yeah, I think it also does something. I think the Google right to be forgotten example, and actually I think the External Oversight Board to an extent do the same thing, is that they're a way of sort of sharing with the public how difficult something is. It sounds, on the face of it, it sounds really simple. Right to be forgotten. Well, who can be against rights? We like rights. But you want to find some forum in which you can discuss those difficult cases, the kind of case I know you hit, where somebody has committed a serious crime, and maybe it was a little bit sort of more distant from today, and that therefore technically under the right to be forgotten, it should be removed, and yet it's on the newspaper website but not in the index. All of this sort of complexity. It's a way of getting that out there, in the way that I think the External Oversight Board is for some cases that Facebook had that people I think previously thought were obvious. This should be simple. It's not. So I think bringing out the complexity of the decision making is an interest that the companies have, where they're in an area and they're frustrated, I guess. And again, I'm sure you experience that. They're frustrated that they're being asked to do something very, very complicated. They're being criticized whichever way they go. They're either, I've used it before, the Goldilocks and Three Bears thing. It's either too hot or too cold. It's never just right, the porridge that they serve up. And so they want people to see how they're making the porridge and how difficult it is, in order to hopefully have some more empathy and understanding of why these decisions are difficult, rather than just assuming the companies are either malicious or stupid, which is usually the start.
Or both, which would be horrible.
Or both,
right?
yes, maliciously stupid.
No,
yeah.
We've been adamant about not asking for sympathy, and I don't think we're asking for sympathy here either. These are hard decisions that should be frustrating to make, I think, in many instances. But let's sort of back out a little bit. We have our first criterion, it's efficiency. We believe that that's a criterion that's actually broadly shared in most communities, that we do believe that going through a court for every single thing that's happening would probably not be a viable option. There are some who think it is, but the vast majority probably think that we look at these three others that you talked about: government, companies, and third parties or civil society. Now what are other criteria that we should use to decide who makes these decisions, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually enshrined in where we started in the GNI is a sort of sense of global human rights principles. And again, it's interesting to see if we do have that common ground. Are we looking at a situation in which we are essentially respecting freedom of expression, perhaps not in the US model? So the US model is extreme for a very good reason. That, again, if you look at it historically, the US was absolutely determined that government should not tell people how they should think, because it was a non-conformist culture. They were escaping the conformity of primarily the British government, but also other governments telling you how you could worship or think or practice your beliefs. So they were determined to make sure government didn't tell them what they could think or do, and that left the space actually for private companies and others to tell you what you can say in particular spaces. So that's a particular model. In the rest of the world, you tend to have a model where governments are able to intervene to an extent, but that's constrained by the fact that they adhere to general human rights principles that say there must be a compelling reason, there must be a demonstrable public interest before we intervene. So I think one of the first questions is what's the structure that is most going to conform to those broad human rights principles where intervention is limited? And I think that actually steers you in many cases away from government as the first option. I mean, the risk of introducing government or giving excessive powers to government is generally, I think, too significant for most people who are in this space to want it to happen in most countries. We're moving in that direction. It's really interesting now to see how people shift, because people are so hostile based on their experiences to the way that companies are doing this, and so distrustful of the companies that they are much more open to government moving into this space. But when they do, and when we look at the detail of that, then I think people are more concerned. And very interestingly, the Canadian government at the moment is considering some legislation to kind of try and regulate harms on the internet. And the Global Network Initiative themselves are giving feedback to the Canadian government to say, be careful that you're not going too far here. So I think that's actually a critical question is, look, if you conform to general human rights principles, even if you're not kind of all the way over to the US First Amendment side of things, to what extent are you comfortable inviting governments in, given that governments can be very oppressive if they take powers to regulate speech and abuse them?
So maximizing the robustness and resilience of human rights principles should be a second criterion. Yeah. We should think about how we can distribute decision making in such a way that these principles are safeguarded. And that's actually where we come back to an argument that I increasingly see poo-pooed in the debate, although I think that there's some real value to it. And that is the argument that where democratic governments may feel they have the legitimacy to take on the decision making in a series of cases, they should assume that other governments that are less democratic will use them as a model and say that we will do the same. This contagion effect is, I don't think that it's not a working argument anymore, because most people think that, it's still going to be different. But I do think that there's some truth to it, because if your second principle is we should maximize the robustness and long-term sustainability of the human rights principles, then we should accept that government as a class making decisions will be both democratic and less democratic, or authoritarian, or dictatorship-like governments, right?
Yeah, but I think there's a critical distinction that is really important to recognize, that I think government as a set of politicians is incredibly risky. As I said before, they have biases. They want to get re-elected. They will make decisions about platform content that they think favor their political faction and disfavor the opposition. They will. It's in their DNA, just like it's in the DNA of companies to favor stuff that will increase their growth and reach and money. And so politicians, if when we talk about government we mean politicians are always going to be a problem, even in supposedly mature democracies. And you just need to look in countries like the UK and the US at the moment, where this, the issues of the culture war and the war on woke and all of these phrases come up, where essentially people are sort of arguing over freedom of expression. From the right is generally championing more freedom of expression, saying, why are we being cancelled and shut down? And the left is champing at the bit because there's not enough hate speech being removed that they think sustains people on the right, and off we go. So government as politicians, I think, very, very high risk for introducing all kinds of new problems and biases. But there's another form of government, which is government as an independent regulator. And this is certainly the proposal in the United Kingdom, for example, is that Ofcom, the telecoms regulator, who are not people who are trying to get re-elected, that they would have the primary power. So if the regulator is truly independent, then that may be okay. But again, even there, what we find is in the UK regulation, there's a proposed regulation, there's a bit where the politicians can give mandates or orders to the regulator. That worries me. Independent regulators can be made dependent. And we've seen that in a number of European countries. And in fact, again, Ofcom, the UK regulator, there's a big sort of row going on at the moment that the government intends to appoint as its chair the person who used to edit the principal right-wing newspaper in the United Kingdom, and so that would call into question their independence. So, say government is an issue. If it's government as politicians, I think we absolutely need to keep them miles away from these decision making. If there is truly an independent regulator who will stand up and has the power to stand up and do the right thing, even when they've got a government screaming at them, and has a board that is genuinely politically independent, then maybe there's a bit more scope for that body to be involved and engaged in decision making.
I tend to be more skeptical than you are on this one, because I think that you're not allowed adjectives when you sort of see large geopolitical comparisons, which means that if you go to say that any kind of class of decisions should be made by governments, then that's one thing. Any class of decisions should be made by regulators, then you'll have to accept that other countries will say, we are allowing our regulators to do this, whether or not you can attach the adjective independent to them. I think that sort of it does have that effect over time. And so I'm a little bit more, I think there's great value in thinking through what it would mean if other entities designated as regulators in other kinds of states also made the same kinds of decisions. For however, I have an enormous amount of respect for most regulators across the world, and I think they're doing a great job. I think Ofcom is certainly an independent regulator, but I do think that the class matters. Yes. when you enter a geopolitical discussion, because that's how the less democratic countries will argue. Right. I think.
And the EU has a certain amount of check and balances, that in the sense that the EU typically will put into its pan-European regulations provisions that require the regulators to be independent, and if a government tried to compromise their independence, then the government of that country could be taken to the European Court of Justice and overruled. Although, as we've seen this week in Poland, there's a Polish court that said, well, no, Polish law, constitutional law, has supremacy over European Court of Justice. So I think you're right to be skeptical. There are these measures in place, but where a government is absolutely determined to corrupt its regulator, subvert its regulator to its own wishes, then in practice there's probably very little that anyone can do to stop that from happening. And if that regulator has control over internet content, then it's going to start to operate in a partisan manner. I don't see any way that can be avoided.
And so we have robustness and resilience of human rights principles. They suggest that we should at least look with scrutiny at government as the place to make decisions, allowing for more decision making for regulators. But what does that principle mean for companies? Should companies then also be looked at with the same level of scrutiny?
Well, I think that yes, and that's, I think, again where the Global Network Initiative creates this interesting model where as part of your commitment, you're committing to a set of human rights principles, and you're committing to be audited on them. And actually, if people haven't looked at them, it's well worth going and having a look at the reports that the GNI issues, as well as some of the internet platforms. A number of telecoms companies actually joined the GNI because they were facing similar challenges. They were operating in countries in Central Asia or Southeast Asia where people accused the telecoms companies of misbehavior and threatening privacy and freedom of expression. And so they joined as well. So you get these really quite good comprehensive reports where all of these companies have carried out an audit. I'm sure critics will say the audit's not rigorous enough or it's not independent enough, but there is a process in place and a report is put out there. So again, I think those models, as a model, it's really interesting that companies should be held to high standards. GNI is a way of them agreeing, saying or declaring that they will be held to those high standards. There are other international sort of business and human rights organizations doing similar things. And once they've signed up to that, they are then audited against those principles. And I think that material is put in the public domain. I think that actually is one way that you can hold them to those standards. In a way, actually similar to the fact that, the European Court of Justice would be looking at, or European Court of Human Rights, indeed, if it's that kind of case, would be looking at what a regulator is doing on behalf of the government, or the government does itself.
And that is interesting, because what we're discussing now is at the tail end of decision making, right? Looking at the decisions post facto and saying this was a good decision or this was a bad decision. That's what sort of the audit part of this is. And so one part of the question that we can ask is, if you look through the decision making process, which pieces of it should be allocated across government and companies and third parties? Another example of decision making delegation to a third party that's actually more about the decision making itself and less about the audits is the GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. That was set up to share information between tech companies in order to make sure that they could make the same decisions around the same sets of content. How do you think that there's a different principle that applies there, or do you think that it's the same?
I think there's an operational side to it. And we should recognize as well that the Global Network Initiative also had that part of its function was to invite member companies to bring difficult issues to in this case, a private forum where they could work with experts and try and make a better decision than they would make on their own. And again, I'm not sure the extent to which people would say that's been successful, but conceptually, the idea of having these fora where you can discuss difficult issues privately, I think, is also extremely helpful, as well as the public audit.
Yeah,
and GIFCT is very much in that space. Yeah, it's by definition, a lot of the questions that are raised around terrorist content on platforms are not necessarily things that will be put fully into the public domain, but to have a space where companies can come together. And actually, in that case, all of the parties are represented, because governments are very significantly part of the GIFCT. Again, they form part of the pressure to set it up, but they'll also be present at the meetings. Although I know that there were, again, conversations around the extent to which constitutionally government should be part of it, given the potential risks of that. But certainly from a sort of functional and operational point of view, it's a space where governments, other experts and companies can talk through the difficult issues and then come up with some common operating principles that they can then all apply and collectively try and reduce the malign influence of content that might be supportive of terrorism on their platforms.
And one thing here that sort of argues for the decision to be made by this third party that coordinates across governments and companies is that you do maximize consistency in the decision making this way, and that has a value on its own, doesn't it?
It does for the users. I mean, for the users, it's kind of odd. And again, we should be careful that there's consistency in some areas. For example, some platforms allow nudity. In fact, some platforms entirely dedicated to nudity, and some don't allow nudity and pornography. And so there's lots of sort of taste and decency questions where platforms will be different from each other. But when it comes to, the really sort of hard end of very, very harmful content, that's where I think consistency is helpful, to kind of understand that, you're never going to be able to, you can't just kind of move your bad content from one platform to another, which is the risk of something like terrorist content.
And the flip side of that is that diversity is also a value that we need to balance, because what you just said is really important, right? The fact that if everybody had the same terms and services, then you couldn't have places on the internet that were more open to controversial kinds of content or less open to them. You couldn't have the family safe website and then the very not family safe website dedicated to nudity, as you would say, right? So another value when we look at the distribution of the decision making between our parties here, it should actually be that we want some diversity. So and the way to do that, of course, is to give it to the companies, because the companies will see that a set of decisions and the way that they make those decisions will have an impact on their competitive advantage.
So I think as long as consumers sort of understand what's going on, diversity is good. It's actually helpful, and it's pro freedom of expression. It's not, we shouldn't be sort of forcing conformity. But there are limits, and this is actually one of the toughest areas to deal with, that the politicians will have to deal with if they want to regulate in this area. So I think most of us would say, look, diversity is okay as long as the speech is not actively harmful. And then that leads you to have to make a decision of what is actively harmful, so harmful that it shouldn't be allowed on any platform at any time ever. And again, I think there'll probably be consensus around the hard end of some of the pro-terrorism or the child abuse type content. But when it comes to things like hate speech or misinformation, I think that's a lot more contentious. And there'll be different views as to whether or not you should allow some platforms to be a bit more hatey and a bit looser with the facts than others, or whether you've got to impose common standards even in these areas. So do you lean in favor of diversity, maybe with an element of a bit of risk as you see it, or do you lean in favor of conformity, which, say, from a freedom of expression point of view, is certainly factually more limiting?
Yeah. And at some point, you also have to realize, I suppose, that what you're talking about here are websites that may just choose to curate certain kinds of content. The Christian website that just chooses to look at the world from a Christian perspective. There is, for example, a version of the Wikipedia that doesn't mention Darwin. So,
yes.
So I mean, the ability to exclude certain kinds of content, the diversity there, when that exclusion is based on other principles than those that actually are common to our society, the human rights principles that you mentioned before, that their diversity does seem to be some kind of value in the interest of diversity of opinion. Now let's come to the hard question then, the really hard question. We have our principles, efficiency, that's why we don't throw everything to the courts. We have the robustness of the human rights principles. We want to allocate decision making across our three parties in order to maximize the long-term sustainability of human rights principles. We have the notion of variance, consistency, and diversity. We need to think about consistency when it comes to the content that everyone agrees should be regulated hard, but also diversity when we look at diversity of opinion. But then we have the last question, which is sort of goes back to where we were in the beginning, and that's, what about the quality of the decision making? How much should the quality of the decision making matter when we decide who gets to make the decision of, for example, content moderation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said earlier, it's interesting that sometimes people will accept the same decision if it's made by one party would be acceptable, but if it's made by another party, it's unacceptable. And so, again, the decision over, for example, a politician's speech on a platform, when even if people agree with the decision, they will disagree with the fact that it's being made by the platform rather than by somebody else. And I think this all, essentially, as I go around this, it sort of steers me back to thinking that getting the quality of decisions you need from a body that is civil society dominant or civil society owned may be the right solution. So that the fear is, that the civil society led organizations would not be able to make the same quality of decision because they're not necessarily equipped for that. They haven't had the experience. They're not at the heart of it. And so I think that's why I think in principle, companies would feel much more comfortable ceding decision-making to civil society organizations. And governments may be comfortable ceding decisions to civil society organizations. The question is, would they be able to operate at scale and reach the same quality levels? And again, we come back to our friend, the External Oversight Board. That really was or is an attempt, I think, by Facebook to say, look, we would like a civil society organization to do this work, and we are going to make sure they've got the resources and give them what they need in order to make high quality decisions. And that level of support actually then has led to criticism because there are people outside of it saying, well, they're a creature of Facebook. They can't possibly be independent. Why is Facebook spending so much money? But I think the reason they are is because, as I say, they're trying to get to that sweet spot of decisions being made by people who are respected, who perhaps have, as I say, everybody is biased in a certain way, but are as unbiased as you can possibly get because they're not party to any of these institutions. There are people who used to be in government but are no longer part of a government. There are people who worked in different industries who are part of that. People who've been in judiciary and regulators. So you're trying to get people who are as independent as possible, and then you're trying to make sure the resources are there and a system is in place for them to make the high quality decisions you want. So I think that's for me, that's why it's such an interesting experiment.
It is a really interesting experiment. I think there's an enormous amount of value in it. And I also think that the way I've sort of conceived of it, and it would be interesting to see since you were such a material force behind it, was that what it allows you to do is not necessarily to improve the quality of the decisions that were already made, but it allows you to improve the decision making going forward. So you have the input from the oversight board, and really one of the metrics for its success has to be, are the decisions made by Facebook over time better because of the oversight board or not? Did you think about that when you were debating
and I will have
this?
to say, my role was as a consultee, an active consultee on the creation of it, and I'll cede to others the credit for actually building it. And it was an interesting process. And I have to say, at the beginning, I was skeptical. I should say that I was, I'm not sure. Well, I was skeptical because from a company point of view, I kind of felt, you're never going to be able to sort of outsource responsibility for these decisions. It's always going to come back to you. And I think to a certain extent that's true. And people still are sort of saying, well, this is really part of Facebook. But having said that, I actually think that the way in which it's been set up is leading to good decisions. And to your point, the fact that there are these public recommendations back to the company is inevitably going to act as a really important force directing the company's future actions. And so, yes, they in theory, they may not implement the changes that are recommended, and they may continue to make poor decisions. But I actually think in practice, because it's public, because the Oversight Board is well resourced and can keep coming back to these issues, Facebook would be extremely foolish not to try and make positive changes on the back of it. So this dynamic of a public interplay between, there's the Facebook decision, and then there's this quite expert, quite well-resourced body looking at that, coming to their own view, and then making recommendations, in many cases, of kind of long-term systemic change, putting that into the public domain is about as effective a mechanism as I can conceive. If you want the more immediate change, you have government regulators just ordering the company to make changes, but that brings these other risks in. So I think it's certainly worth exploring this model. Interesting would be how you marry this model with the regulator model. Is there one where you've got a three-legged stool where the company decisions are going to an external oversight board or going to a civil society organization primarily for the criticism, and then you also then have a piece of government sort of in there trying to give some authority to this or acting as some kind of backstop power, and that may be a future evolution of the model.
And one way to think about it is you shouldn't allocate the decision-making power as to make the individual decision as good as possible, but you should allocate it in such a way that quality increases over time.
Yes.
That there's like learning built into the system, because if there's learning built into the system and quality increases over time, then at that point that the allocation of decision-making responsibility makes sense. And the inverse of that would be if you're sort of allocating decision-making power in such a way that it essentially is random or haphazard or driven by the press cycle or something like that, then you're shortchanging all of society on how to make these decisions. So we're it's interesting because that means that the individual decision might not be the focus of our quality discussion as we thought in the beginning, but rather the overall increase in quality in decision making over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's the case, and so the legislation is sort of heading in that direction. Because I'm not. Again, when you're dealing with individual pieces of content, there's the old phrase "hard cases make bad law." There are a lot of those. Like sort of individual cases on their own, if you overreact to them, I mean, they can be very exercising people at the time, but if you overreact to an individual case, you then end up sort of creating a precedent, and that then is actually unhelpful. And so I think you're right, the measure should be over time. And what are those measures? Like how do you sort of measure satisfaction over time, I think is the key question. And again, satisfaction in terms of content decisions are, look, if it's your content that's taken down, you're unhappy. And if you made a complaint and no action was taken, you're unhappy. So again, you're almost invariably going to make, back to your binary decision-making entities, you're going to make one party unhappy, whichever decision you take. So how do we sort of weight the relative unhappiness of those parties, I think is a key part of that decision-making process. And then back to our audit question, coming back and saying, look, whose unhappiness do we care most about? Well, that will depend on external assessment of things like were the decisions consistent with the right to freedom of expression, right to privacy, and so on.
But this is where you could poll, for example, on legitimacy, because legitimacy would be the one metric that you want to get back to. So people may disagree with individual court decisions, but uniformly across at least a lot of different nations, courts have very high legitimacy. They're seen as independent arbiters in a good way. And so if you start measuring yesterday almost and sort of look at the legitimacy of the decision making around content moderation, for example, and then you track over time, you may have some kind of indication at least on where the decision making overall is going, because ultimately that is how this is judged, right? When we distribute the decision making, the way that we know that we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing is if whether or not people think that the decisions made are legitimate. Isn't that right?
Partly, but again, it's who's making that assessment. Here's a real risk area. Maybe I'll sound like whatever metropolitan elite, but I actually think so. I think what we know is that company decision making is generally criticized. I mean, people from across the political spectrum, from all different quarters, will criticize company decision making. I think if you went out to the public, a lot of the public would say, no, government should do this. And this is my metropolitan elite thing, is they're wrong to think that they can trust their government with this. But I actually think, in a lot of countries, again, US perhaps being an honorable exception, but certainly in many countries of the world, people would say, well, no, it's my government who should get to decide this because I vote for the government. And they might not have the same sort of hesitancy that you and I have had on this call. With the civil society decision-making, I think it could reach the level of confidence. It could compete with government. But here's again, I will criticize the critics of the External Oversight Board or criticize the critics of the GNI and other initiatives, that what they're doing is effectively undermining our attempts to create civil society organizations that could take this decision-making away from companies. I actually really worry about that at the moment, that I think these are good faith efforts to try and create something new. And yet a lot of people who I think should be supportive of them are too quick to criticize them. And then we're left with this position, which I find really uncomfortable. Look, having trashed the company decision-making and then having equally trashed any of these new civil society organizations that are created to do it, you are only left with government being able to make those decisions. And I say that's in a sense a political viewpoint to decide how comfortable you are. I see a bigger role for government and a bigger role for regulation. I think that's inevitable. But the old phrase, was it quis custodiet custodies? Who's watching the watchers? And I'm only comfortable where I believe that whoever is doing this on behalf of government can genuinely be challenged, is truly independent, and is not going to get subverted by the political system. And I think one of the ways, again, that you do that is you have civil society organizations, keeping track of the government pieces. So the role for civil society organizations is essential, I think, from a human rights perspective, if all of this is going to work.
And that's such interesting. It's an interesting conclusion in a sense, because what it says is that for this to succeed, you need both companies and the critics of the companies to move into this yes and the mentality, to sort of speak with pop psychology. So yes and build out the institutional option into something that can viably be an alternative to government decision making or corporate decision making on its own. So let's sort of boil all of this down, looking at the way that the social media discussion is going today, looking at the many sort of criticisms out there. What would your advice be in terms of the institutional option? Do you think more people should have their own oversight boards? Do you think there should be one joint oversight board where these decisions can be challenged and audited? Do you think that all of content moderation should be outsourced to an independent third party, doing it in real time for all social media platforms? Would that even be possible? How do you think, where would you like this to go?
I would like to see, I think, more institutions being created, and that those institutions are very open, transparent, and share with the public their learning, good and bad. And we've mentioned a couple of things. There's GNI, there's the GIFCT that you mentioned. Actually, in the UK, we've had for many years an organization called the Internet Watch Foundation that does something similar around child abuse content. Again, it's an industry civil society body, strongly supported by government and yet not part of government. I think we should be looking at all of these models and seeing how far we can go by strengthening them. And I think that requires us to be less binary about it and less sort of judgmental. And so the Internet Watch Foundation, I think, has done a great job. But from a pure constitutional point of view, people will criticize and go, who the hell are they to tell people to deal with child abuse content? That's a job for government. No. If it works well, how do we, and you worry about accountability, how do you make it more accountable? Not how do you get rid of it or undermine it or reduce it. So I would love to see a lot more of these. And I'd like to, a big effort to say, look, how do we build that capacity, that muscle of people who are not just campaigning? It's easy to campaign against a company. It's much harder to do the same work that the company does and do it really well. So how do we move from campaigning to actually building institutions that can do all of this work and try lots of different models? I think all of the ones you mentioned, there's potential for that. And then critically, how do we have hooks in the legislation where these bodies can be legitimately doing the work truly independently of government, but within a regulatory framework. And that, I think, as a legal challenge, is a fun one that certainly the UK, EU, Canada, and other countries will probably be grappling with over the next few months.
Yeah, the EU has an interesting hook in the DSA around these codes of conduct that they're thinking about, which I think is an opportunity. And largely, I think the reality is that this is an institutional moment for tech, and the opportunity is great, but it requires the critics to think about this as a way forward rather than to think about this as a way to cop out of responsibility. I think that's a high threshold, especially now we're in the midst of sort of a really heated debate. So it'll be really interesting to track over time to see how this institutional moment plays out. But I certainly think that both the GNI, the GIFCT, the Oversight Board, or the Right to be Forgotten Observatory were examples that show that there is a positive upside from the institutional engagement and the third-party work that tech companies are doing. And I, for one, hope to see a lot more of that.
You say that and I say that. There are probably some people out there, not sure they'd even bother to listen to this, who would say, they're all just whitewashing. They're all just the companies.
Yes.
Trying to put it on the good front. But they're wrong. They're wrong. This is
but they're wrong. I think we've devolved into the late hours of the pub discussion, where they're wrong.
Yes.
Well, on that note, and we are often wrong, but we're wrong with a gusto that allows you to explore the options. So on that note, I think we'll conclude this, and you can find the podcast on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
And we hope to have you with us for our next episode. Thank you so much for listening.